So please have your Bibles with you, and we're going to go through the Mark chapter 5 passage. I remember a while back I was sitting in a hospital room and the door opened and a doctor walks over to me and she tells me what is happening in the operating room upstairs. At that particular moment I was feeling like everything was out of my hands. I was out of control. I was powerless to do anything in that moment. So what did I do? I just sat there and prayed. I think we've come to a moment like this in our community. The coronavirus has left us all, I think, feeling powerless. We are less in control than we used to be. We're not able to do what we want to do. And we don't know whether this virus will come back for a second round or not, or whether schools and restaurants will stay open. As a society, we've made incredible advances in science. We have clean water, we have aeroplanes, we have cures for terrible diseases. But is a cure really what we need to regain a sense of power? Well, as much as I thank God for the wonderful work of science and technology, this doesn't really get to the heart of our problem of powerlessness, especially in the face of sickness and death. We're never really in control, I think. I think if you start to think about it, society was felled by a tiny virus. The virus has exposed how little power we really have as human beings. And as we come to this passage here today, we meet a couple of people who come to realise they're powerless. They know they are powerless. And friends, this is what we need to realise as well. These people here know they need Jesus because they see in him the one who has power over sickness, power over death. So today, let me show you from Mark chapter 5 why you need him as well. So as we come to the passage, hope you have it there with you. As we come to the passage, the first thing I want us to see here is that Jesus is able to save anyone. He's able to save. He has power. Nothing is outside his control, even sickness. In verse 21, we meet Jesus here, and there's a crowd of people following him. And this crowd, they want to hear from Jesus. They want to see Jesus. They want to be healed. And that's just what happens in verse 22. Let me read it. Verse 22. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. Verse 23, and he begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." Maybe it's the parent in me that has brought this out, but any time when a little child is sick is horrifying. And Jairus here, the dad, the synagogue leader, he's the guy who organises the worship of Jews who gather on the Sabbath. He's a well-respected person in the community. He's upright. He's well liked, and yet he is here fallen on his face. He's in the dirt. He's fallen at the feet of Jesus. And he's begging Jesus, pleading with Jesus to earnestly heal his little girl. It's a picture of desperation that is painted here. He's someone who knows he has no power. So he runs and falls at the feet of someone he thinks does have power. I just want to say, friends, that Christianity speaks into the real world. The Bible doesn't pretend that sickness is something to shrug off or just get over. Friends, we live in a broken world. Our bodies, although they're good and we can't despise them, they just don't work in the way they were meant to. As we get older, we begin to feel it in our bones. And sometimes we get news we just don't want to hear. Sin's effects, you see, have seeped into every part of God's good creation. aches, pains that won't go away, sicknesses without cure, and death for every one of us. But here in Mark chapter 5, we get a glimpse that this is not all there is to life. This passage points us to why Jesus came into the world, because notice what Jesus does next. Look at the verse 24 here. What does it say? It says, "So Jesus went with him." It's a simple and understated line. Mark seems like a typical bloke, I think, very economical with words. Jesus went with him. Jesus goes with Jairus. And this is important, friends. He doesn't brush him off. He doesn't say, "I've got too much on my Google Calendar this week." He listens, he goes. And as Jesus goes, and as the crowd presses in around him, there in the crowd is this woman. We meet this woman here, and she's been bleeding. Verse 25. It doesn't say what medical condition she has, but she's been bleeding for 12 long years. In the law of Moses, in Jewish law, it's possible that this bleeding would have made her ceremonially unclean. And if this were the case, she would have been socially isolated from other Jews, from her friends, her family, socially distant, physically isolated from other people for 12 long years. But look at verse 26. Look at verse 26. She had endured much under many doctors. Verse 26, she had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. The treatments hadn't worked. Doctors had done her harm. And the medical bills, you see, would just keep getting worse. They'd left her broke. Just like Jairus, she's powerless. But you see, she has a light bulb moment. You can see it here, verse 27. Verse 27, having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. She seems to have some mixed up idea about Jesus' clothes having power. Verse 28, for she said, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well." What is going on here? But what she does get right is that she needs to go to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus has power. And as she sneaks up and touches Jesus' clothes, she is healed. That's in verse 29. And it says here, she's healed instantly, just then and there. Doctors' appointments, waiting rooms, hospital visits, endless appointments, rebooking at the front desk. This had gone on for 12 long years. But she reaches out, and instantly she's healed. Just imagine what's going on in her mind right now. No longer an outsider, no longer viewed as unclean. Jesus has made her whole, healed and well again, socially and physically. If you think about it, these two people, Jairus and this woman, are really at the end of the road. They're utterly powerless to do anything about their circumstances. Jairus is facing the death of his little girl, and the woman's suffering is getting worse. Friends, I don't know your story at all, but you don't have to look far. You don't have to look far to see and experience the effects of sickness and death. And I can guarantee that sooner rather than later, stories like this come into your life as well. The coronavirus situation, I believe, has made us more aware of our fragility, that as human beings, our lives are fragile. There is a real possibility that people will get sick, people we know who will get sick. Now, you might not think this when you're 16 years old or something like that, but life is fragile. And we can feel powerless in the face of it. But this is why God's word, this passage in Mark here, brings good news to us. Because we see here that Jesus has the power to save anyone. Anyone. He has power. This woman is completely healed. Jesus is powerful over sickness. Jesus healed people. And this all points to why Jesus had come into the world. He came to bring healing and wholeness to the broken people of God, indeed to the broken creation itself. Every healing we read about in the Gospels shows Jesus is able to save. He's able to heal. This miracle shows us his power, and it shows us why Jesus came. It's like an entree, a taster, a morsel just getting us ready for when Jesus will make all things new, when he comes again and restores all things. So friends, you might feel powerless. We might feel powerless, as we wait for a blood test result or something like that. But know this, Jesus is not powerless. He's powerful. God may or may not grant you healing now, but please go to him like Jairus does. Fall at his feet in prayer. He listens to you and is with you every step of the way. He is the great physician of our bodies and souls. So not only is Jesus powerful, but secondly, he wants us to believe him, to trust him. And that's what we see here. If we pick up the passage again, we just remember what's going on. Jesus is on the way to Jairus' house when he meets this woman. And at Jairus' house, there's this little girl who is dying. And you think the little girl would be the top priority, right? The number one thing to do at that particular time. It's pretty urgent, we might think, but look at verse 30. What does verse 30 say? At once, Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who had touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" I went to a concert end of last year at the Sydney Cricket Ground. It was raining, so we wanted to get right up near the edge of the stage. No one else wanted to get wet, so we got wet and went right up the front. But at the front of a concert, in the crowd is so tightly packed in. It's so pressed in, and so if you want to go anywhere, if you want to go out to get something to eat or something, you have to push your way through people to get anywhere. And you get that picture here in this passage. The crowd is packed in. And in verse 30, Mark gives us this insight, this intriguing insight into who Jesus is. He's God, he has power, divine power to heal, but he's also truly human, empowered by the Holy Spirit. You see, Jesus knows he's healed someone, but he doesn't know who, so he needs to look around to find out who healed him. Find out who touched him, I should say, sorry. And the disciples are perplexed. Verse 31. They're in a crowd. People are brushing up against him all the time. What's Jesus on about? And the question is, why does Jesus stop? Even though he's on the way to Jairus' house, he stops. It's a strange moment, I think. Even though he's on the way to Jairus' daughter, who's dying, he wants to talk to the person who's touched him. There's a stressed dad here, remember? There's a girl who's dying, but Jesus stops. He turns. And the question is why? Why does he stop? It's because he needs to teach this person something, this woman something. Look at verse 32. But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." You see, this woman wants to slip away quietly, no fuss. But Jesus actually brings her healing public. He seeks her out. He actually exposes her to what she's afraid of. And she comes, you see here, to Jesus with fear and trembling. And she spills the beans. She tells him the whole story of what it was like for her for these 12 long years. And Jesus calms her fears and affectionately calls her daughter, verse 34. But why did Jesus search for her? Why didn't he just let her slip away? It's because he wanted to teach her about faith. Your faith has saved you, Jesus says. That's verse 34. You see, Jesus is gently teaching her about the importance of faith. She wasn't healed because she'd snuck up and touched his clothes. The clothes don't have power. You know, we often have mixed up ideas about who God is and who Jesus is in our minds. We make mistakes. But God is so gracious to us, isn't he? God is so kind to us in that he saves us, calls us his own, really despite us. That's the important thing about faith. But what is faith? Faith is more than just wishful thinking. It's more than just hoping for the best. What Jesus is getting at here is faith in him. This woman's faith, you see, is much deeper than a physical healing from bleeding. It's much more because it's saving faith, you see. It's saving faith in Jesus. This woman's now a Christian. She's put her faith in Jesus. You know, when someone explores Christianity, they'll often wrestle with the Bible. They'll ask heaps of questions, which is, by the way, a great thing to do. But what does it mean to put our faith in Jesus? We've got to understand it's not about what we do. It's all about who we put our faith in. It's about Jesus. He's the one we're to put our faith in, because he alone has power to save. Friends, there's no way you and I would believe in Jesus, put our faith in Jesus, unless God took hold of our hearts and brings us to saving faith. You see, if you want to be saved, friend, it's not faith for faith's sake. It's not the faith itself. The crucial thing is the object of faith. What you put your faith in. That's what's important. You need to put your faith in Jesus. Only he is able to save. So let me ask you, what are you trusting in? Who are you believing? What are you putting your faith in? No matter who you are, what you've done, or even how weak and confused your faith is, like these people here, if you put your faith in Jesus, you'll be saved. And Jesus helps the woman realize this here. And so he blesses her, Jesus blesses her, verse 34, and now she's at peace with God. Be well, be whole, go on newfound life, and be healed of your disease. But the scene shifts again here in this passage, because Jesus now wants to teach Jairus about faith as well. Look at verse 35. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" I don't know about you, but when I hear that someone I love has died, that particular moment is burned into my memory. I can picture it now as clear as day. And so Jairus hears his daughter is dead. It would have crushed him. There's nothing more that Jesus can do, these people say. Jesus has other things to do. Why bother him anymore? Jairus would have been absolutely devastated. But Jesus, you see, overhears what's going on. He overhears the sad news. Verse 36. When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." You see, Jesus has taken the woman to her fears. Jesus, in his delay, has taken Jairus to his worst nightmare. His little girl has died. But in your worst nightmare, don't be afraid. Keep on believing in me. You see, he wants to teach Jairus about faith, as he often wants to teach us about faith. Friends, the delays which God brings into your life are not pointless. You know, we might not know why we go through dark valleys, the disappointments, when plans don't work out, when things fail, when we are crushed by terrible news. But in those moments, Jesus calls us to trust him, believe him, have faith, trust me, believe me, Jesus says. And the fact that Jairus keeps on going with Jesus here is a testimony to his faith. He trusts Jesus, even at that particular moment when he's crushed. You see, friends, faith, however shaky, if it has its object in God, you see, God holds us tight. If we trust God, he is faithful to his promises. You see, faith is more than wishful thinking. It's more than optimism. It's more than a hope that everything will come good in the end. Jairus looks Jesus in the eye here and trusts him despite his circumstances. He rests completely on Jesus. He believes that Jesus knows what he's doing, that he's good, that he's able to carry out what he promises. Don't be afraid, Jesus says to us. Only believe. And now finally we move into the third point. And we see that Jesus has power over everything. He has power over what we are most powerless in the face of. He has power over death. So in verse 37, Jesus gets rid of the crowd. He takes his friends with him. He's only his closest friends here. In verse 38, they get to Jairus' house and they find mourners. They're wailing really loudly. Verse 38 there. There's a commotion going on, which is unlike our funerals, isn't it? Which are quiet and somber. There's a lot of noise going on at this funeral. Let me read verse 39. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making such a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." Verse 40. They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and all those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. Weeping to laughing. Everyone knows the little girl is dead, right? She's dead, not asleep, Jesus. It's obvious. But what's going on? You see, death is not the final word in this little girl's life. Death isn't the last word for this little girl. And Jesus leads mum and dad and his friends to where she is. He takes them into the room where the child was. He reaches out and takes the little girl by the hand. See that in verse 41. He takes the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." If you think about it, Jesus speaks to a dead person. He speaks to a corpse. She can't hear you, Jesus, we might think. And what does it say? Verse 42, immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old, and they were utterly astounded. Understandably so, right? And their fears vanish. And Jesus tells them to keep it quiet because the girl must have been hungry from being sick for so many days. She wouldn't have eaten anything. So in a delightful human touch, he tells someone to get her some food. It's an amazing and miraculous moment, isn't it? The dead listen to Jesus' voice. The voice of Christ raises the dead. You see, even death, that great enemy has no power over Jesus. Jesus has power over death. He speaks life into the dead girl. His word, you see, that which spoke this universe into existence, gives life to this little girl again. And friends, you see, he gives life to men and women, to boys and girls, to us. He raises us to spiritual life by his voice. And one day, bodily life with him as well. Jesus has power over everything, you see, even death. Friends, it's verses like these that give me hope, that give us hope. You see, Jesus is able to save anyone. He wants us to believe him, to put our faith in him. Even death itself is no barrier to him. Oh, to live in a world where children's hospitals and intensive care wards are no longer needed, right? We live in a sad world where sin and suffering are far too common. We try and keep it away from us, don't we? But our bodies are broken. And as human beings, we feel the effects of disease, the coronavirus, cancer, dementia and death. Yet for the Christian, these are not the final words. The voice of Jesus brings life. Even death is not a barrier for him. Friends, even though we might feel powerless as we walk through dark valleys in the face of death, but Jesus isn't powerless. So while we wait for that time, we perhaps need to think differently about death, perhaps in a different way. Jesus wants us to believe him, to know he is powerful to save anyone and powerful over everything. If you trust in Jesus today, death is not the final word in your life, because Jesus himself has died and has risen again. Death has lost its sting. Sin has been paid for, so all who believe in him will rise as well. Even though we might feel powerless in the hospital room or in this coronavirus time, we can know that Jesus is powerful in our lives now and even over death itself. And he calls us to put our trust in him.